Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back, to a world lit by flickering torches and smelling faintly of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and well, let's just say questionable food. Imagine yourself trudging through muddy streets, the air thick with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, blacksmiths hammering, and the general chaotic hum of medieval life. It's loud, it's crowded, and honestly, you probably won't survive this journey without a serious case of the medieval squirts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the bustling heart of a medieval town, maybe London, maybe Paris, maybe somewhere smaller and stinkier. Your stomach rumbles. It's been a long day of, doing medieval things, like trying not to step in sewage or dodging wandering livestock. You don't have a kitchen, or maybe you do, but cooking is a whole thing requiring firewood, pots, and actual effort. This is where the medieval equivalent of fast food comes in. Forget drive-thrus, think walk-up windows, or more likely, a vendor with a portable brazier set up on a street corner, yelling about their hot pies. This isn't fancy, sit-down restaurant stuff. This is grab and go. It's cheap, it's quick, and it's designed to fill you up without emptying your meager coin purse. The aroma hitting you first is probably roasting meat. Little skewers of chicken, maybe goose if you're lucky, sizzling over coals. Or perhaps the smell of baking bread, often mixed with the slightly greasy scent of fillings. You see vendors holding up small, handheld pies, the pastry often thick and sturdy, designed less for delicate flakiness and more for containing the contents and being eaten on the move without making a total mess. Think of it as the original Hot Pocket, but probably made with actual ingredients and significantly more dubious hygiene standards. These pies, often called coffins because the crust was more like a case, could contain anything from minced meat, beef, mutton, pork, to fowl, or even fish on fast days. They were the ultimate portable meal. You'd buy one hot, maybe wrapped in a bit of cloth if you were lucky, and eat it as you walked, the savory juices threatening to dribble down your chin. It's the comfort food of the working class, the travelers, the people who couldn't afford or access a proper meal cooked at home or an inn. Beyond pies, you'd find fritters. Oh, the fritters. Little blobs of dough, often mixed with fruit like apples or pears, or sometimes vegetables, deep-fried in bubbling fat right there on the street. Imagine the smell, sweet, greasy, slightly smoky. They're basically medieval donuts or tempura, depending on what was mixed in. You'd buy a handful, hot and probably a bit unevenly cooked, and pop them in your mouth as you hurried along. They're sugary, they're fatty, they're everything your body craves for a quick energy boost when you're running on empty. And because they were fried, they felt substantial, a real treat. Another common sight would be vendors selling cooked pulses, peas, beans, lentils, often made into a thick pottage or stew. Served hot, maybe in a simple earthenware bowl you'd have to return, or buy. If you were feeling fancy, it was hearty and cheap protein. Not exactly junk food in the modern sense, but definitely fast, cheap, and readily available street fare. It's the medieval equivalent of grabbing a cup of soup or a hot dog from a cart. Historians still argue whether the crust of those meat pies was actually meant to be eaten or if it was primarily just a cooking vessel and wrapper, like a medieval Tupperware container you could discard. Some evidence suggests the very poor might eat it, while others might just break it open for the filling. Either way, it served its purpose, keeping the good stuff inside while you were on the go. It's a far cry from the delicate, flaky pastry you might find today. This was thick, tough, and often made with less refined flour. A quirky tidbit? Some street vendors would sell hot eels, either roasted or stewed. Eels were surprisingly common and relatively cheap in medieval waterways. So, while you might be picturing a hot dog stand, replace the hot dogs with slippery, cooked eels on a stick. Appetizing, right? Just another delicious option from the medieval street food menu. The sheer variety, despite the apparent simplicity, was key. You needed options that catered to different tastes and, crucially, different budgets. The roasted meat skewer was probably more expensive than a handful of pea fritters, which were likely more expensive than a scoop of hot bean pottage. It was a tiered system of quick eats, accessible to most town dwellers, offering a break from the monotonous diet many faced at home. It was food designed for convenience, for speed, for the reality of a busy, dirty, and often hungry urban life. You see a vendor, you hand over a coin or two, you get something hot and filling, and you keep moving. It's the original grab-and-go culture, born out of necessity and the simple desire for something tasty and quick in a world that offered very little of either with ease. Beyond the savory pies and hot eels you might snatch from a street vendor, there was another, perhaps even more enticing, world of quick eats beckoning you with the promise of sweetness. If the savory options were the medieval equivalent of a burger or a hot dog, these were the donuts, the pastries, the sugary pick-me-ups designed to give you a rapid, and likely temporary, burst of energy. We touched on fritters briefly, those little fried blobs of joy, but the sweet side of medieval convenience food goes deeper than just simple dough balls. Imagine the smell now: less roasting meat, more warm spices like cinnamon or ginger, maybe the scent of cooked apples or pears, all mingling with the unmistakable aroma of bubbling fat. This is the world of medieval pastries and fried dough variations. While refined sugar was incredibly expensive and mostly reserved for the elite or for medicinal purposes, yes, sugar was medicine back then, go figure, honey was relatively abundant, and fruit was seasonal but often preserved. This meant that sweet treats relied heavily on these natural sweeteners, along with spices and sometimes even sweetened cheese. You'd see vendors selling small tarts, maybe hand-sized, filled with fruit preserves or a mixture of spiced honey and nuts. These weren't the delicate, flaky tarts you might find in a modern patisserie. The pastry was often sturdier, more like a short crust or even a slightly sweetened bread dough, again, designed to be held and eaten without a plate. Think of a sealed turnover or a mini hand pie. The fillings could be simple, stewed apples or cherries, or more complex, involving dried fruits like figs or dates, sometimes mixed with spices and even a bit of suet or butter for richness. Then there were the fritters, making a triumphant return to our story. We mentioned simple dough fritters, but the sweet versions were the real stars. Picture little scoops of batter, often enriched with eggs or milk, if available, plunged into hot fat. Sometimes fruit was mixed directly into the batter, chopped apples, berries, or even pieces of pear. These fruit fritters would puff up as they fried, becoming golden and slightly crispy on the outside, with pockets of warm, soft fruit within. A common variation involved dipping pieces of fruit, like apple rings, directly into batter and then frying them. Basically, medieval apple fritters and tempura-style fruit. And yes, they were just as addictive as they sound, leaving you with greasy fingers and a sticky chin, but utterly worth it. Historians still argue whether some of these fried dough items, particularly those made from leavened dough, should be classified as early forms of donuts or simply as variations of fritters. The lines were blurry. You might find twisted pieces of dough, fried until golden, sometimes dusted with sugar or drizzled with honey. These could be called crespe or crispelli in Italian texts, essentially medieval crullers or donuts without the hole. They were simple, quick to make, and provided that satisfying combination of fried goodness and sweetness. A quirkier tidbit about medieval sweet treats is the use of vegetables in surprising ways. While we think of fruit in pastries, you might also find fillings made from sweetened carrots or parsnips, spiced and cooked down with honey. They were naturally sweet vegetables, and when combined with expensive spices, they could mimic the taste of fruit fillings for those who couldn't afford the real thing year-round. So, that delicious pastry you just bought might actually be filled with spiced parsnips. Enjoy. The process of making these was fascinatingly simple and efficient for street vendors. A brazier, a pot of fat, often animal fat like lard or suet, or sometimes oil if you were near olive-growing regions, though that was less common in Northern Europe, and a bowl of batter or dough. The speed was key. You could churn out dozens of fritters or small pastries in minutes, selling them hot off the frying fat. This made them incredibly accessible. A few pennies could get you a handful of hot, sweet fritters, a perfect treat for a child or a quick sugar rush for a weary laborer. These sweet snacks weren't just about satisfying a craving, they were often seen as energy boosters. In a world with no energy drinks or protein bars, a handful of fat-fried, honey-sweetened dough was a quick way to get calories into your system. They were dense, filling, and provided that instant hit that modern junk food aims for. You'd grab them on the way to market, on your break from the workshop, or just as a small indulgence after a long day. They were the original impulse buy, strategically placed where hungry people were passing by. Mainstream historical fact time: before the widespread availability of granulated sugar, honey was the primary sweetener used in European cooking, including pastries and sweets. Its distinct flavor profile shaped the taste of medieval desserts significantly, often combined with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, which were also highly valued and expensive imports. So, that gingerbread taste you associate with Christmas? It has deep medieval roots, often sweetened with honey. The appeal of these fried treats was universal. They were hot, often crispy, and packed with flavor and calories. They felt indulgent, even if they were made from relatively simple ingredients. Imagine the scene: a vendor stirring a pot of bubbling fat, the sweet aroma wafting through the street, drawing people in. It was sensory marketing at its finest, long before anyone knew what marketing was. You see it, you smell it, you crave it, you buy it. Simple as that. And you probably didn't stop to think too much about how clean the fat was or how many times it had been reheated. Ignorance was probably bliss in many aspects of medieval life, especially when it came to street food. So, as you continue your imaginary stroll through the medieval town, past the savory pie stands and the hot eel carts, take a moment to appreciate the sweet temptations. The little fruit tarts, the endless variations of hot, greasy, delicious fritters, the fried dough twists promising a sugary crunch. They were the comfort food, the small luxuries, the quick energy fixes of their time. And they left a legacy that continues today in our love for donuts, churros, and all things fried and sweet. Just try not to get any on your tunic. Or maybe do, it'll add to the authentic medieval look. Okay, so you've had your sugar rush from the fritters and maybe even risked a bite of that questionable parsnip pastry. Your sweet tooth is temporarily satisfied, but let's be honest, you're still feeling that medieval hunger pang, the kind that only something substantial can fix. Stepping away from the sweet vendors, your nose picks up a different scent now, something richer, smokier, undeniably meaty. This is the domain of roasted meats and pies, the hearty, protein-packed core of medieval fast food. Imagine the scene: a vendor, apron probably stained with various animal fats, turning skewers over a crackling fire. The meat sizzles, drips, and sends plumes of delicious-smelling smoke into the air, a siren call to any empty stomach within 50 yards. This wasn't just a smell, it was an advertisement, a promise of hot, ready-to-eat sustenance. You'd see small birds, maybe pigeons, quails, or even sparrows, yes, sparrows, trussed up and roasting whole, their skins crisping nicely. Or perhaps chunks of mutton, pork, or beef threaded onto a skewer, turning slowly. These roasted meats were the ultimate grab-and-go protein. You'd point at what you wanted, hand over your coin, and the vendor would slice off a piece or hand you a whole little bird. No plates needed, just your hands, which, let's face it, you probably haven't washed recently anyway. It was messy, greasy, and utterly satisfying. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a kebab stand, but maybe with fewer hygiene regulations and a higher chance of getting a feather stuck in your teeth. Beyond the simple roasted skewers, the meat found its way into those ubiquitous pies we talked about earlier. Remember those sturdy coffins? While some contained vegetable or fish fillings, meat was the star of many. The fillings could be incredibly varied, often using cuts of meat that might be less desirable for a sit-down meal, scraps, offal, or tougher bits that benefited from long cooking inside the pie crust. They mince the meat, often mix it with fat, maybe some breadcrumbs to bind it, and definitely a generous dose of spices to mask any questionable flavors or simply make it taste exciting. Historians still argue whether the quality of meat used in these street pies was consistently poor or if vendors sometimes used decent cuts to attract customers. It's likely a mix, depending on the vendor, the price, and the day's catch, or slaughter. What is clear is that these pies were a clever way to make less than prime meat palatable and portable. Cooking the meat inside the thick crust also served as a form of preservation, protecting the filling from airborne contaminants and extending its shelf life slightly, a crucial factor in a world without refrigeration. A quirky tidbit about these meat pies: they didn't always contain just one type of meat. Sometimes, they were a veritable medieval mystery mix. You might find pork and beef together, or even meat mixed with fish on non-fasting days, creating flavor combinations that might seem odd to us today but were perfectly acceptable then. Imagine biting into a pie expecting mutton and getting a surprise chunk of eel. Delightful. Or perhaps terrifying. Depends on your culinary adventurousness. The availability of different meats varied greatly depending on location and season. Pork was common, especially in autumn after the pigs were fattened. Mutton and beef were also staples, though perhaps less readily available as quick snacks than smaller game or birds. Poultry like chickens and geese were kept in towns, making them accessible. And remember, even wild game like rabbits or pigeons could end up on a street vendor's brazier or in a pie. It was about using what was available and cheap. The process of preparing these meat snacks was designed for speed and volume. For pies, the filling would often be pre-cooked or partially cooked before being sealed in the dough and baked. This meant the final baking time was shorter, allowing vendors to churn out pies quickly. For roasted meats, a hot fire and constant turning were key. The goal was to get the meat cooked through and appealingly browned as fast as possible to meet the demand of hungry passers-by. You weren't getting a slow-roasted masterpiece. You were getting something hot, savory, and ready now. These meat offerings weren't just for the working poor, though they certainly relied on them. Even wealthier individuals might grab a hot pie or a skewer if they were traveling or simply didn't want the fuss of a full meal. It was the original convenience food for everyone, regardless of class. A quick fix for hunger that bypassed the need for kitchen access or dining etiquette. You could eat it standing, walking, or leaning against a wall, wiping the grease on your sleeve like a true medieval connoisseur. Mainstream historical fact time: meat consumption, even among the lower classes, was surprisingly high in medieval England compared to many other historical periods and regions. This was partly due to the abundance of livestock and game, and the relative affordability of certain cuts and types of meat, especially offal and less prized parts, which were often used in pies and stews sold by street vendors. It wasn't just feasts for the rich. Everyday people ate meat too, often in these quick, convenient forms. The fat content in these meat snacks was also significant. Meat was often fatty, and vendors wouldn't shy away from using the fat in the cooking process or leaving it attached to the meat. Fat meant calories, energy, and flavor. In a world where hard physical labor was the norm and food could be scarce, maximizing calorie intake with fatty meats was a practical strategy, even if it might not be what your modern cardiologist would recommend. Your medieval body needed that dense energy source to get through the day of dodging sewage and lifting heavy things. It's like the medieval version of hitting up a greasy spoon diner for a quick, heavy meal. And yes, the potential digestive consequences we hinted at earlier? They were very real with these meat snacks. The combination of questionable hygiene, potentially less than fresh ingredients, high fat content, and rapid consumption while on the move was a recipe for, well, let's just say an eventful trip to the medieval privy. Or ditch. Wherever you did your business. Remember that cheeky line from the intro? It applies particularly well here. You were trading convenience and taste for a significant risk of gastrointestinal distress. But hey, it was hot, it was meaty, and it filled you up. Worth it? In the moment, probably. Later? Maybe not so much. So, as you move on from the sweet temptations, taking a bite of a hot meat pie or gnawing on a roasted pigeon leg, you're experiencing the savory side of medieval junk food. It's simple, it's hearty, it's designed for speed and portability, and it definitely makes you appreciate modern food safety standards. But there's an undeniable appeal to that sizzling meat and those robust, handheld pies. It's the taste of necessity meeting opportunity, the original fast food fueled by fire, and the endless hunger of the medieval street. So, you've just devoured a hot meat pie, perhaps chased it down with a handful of greasy fritters. Your mouth feels a bit coated. And let's be honest, after that questionable eel snack from earlier, you're probably feeling a bit parched. You need something to wash it all down. Now, your first instinct might be to grab a refreshing glass of water. But hold your horses, or rather, hold your potentially contaminated bucket. In the medieval world, clean drinking water wasn't always readily available, especially in bustling towns and cities. Rivers were often used as open sewers. Remember that sewage dodging we talked about? Wells could be polluted, and sanitation standards were, shall we say, evolving. Drinking straight water was a gamble you often didn't want to take, unless you knew the source was reliably pure, which was rare for the average person on the go. This necessity gave rise to the prominence of other beverages, specifically those that were fermented. The process of fermentation, turning sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide, kills off many harmful bacteria. It was an accidental form of purification, a life-saving side effect discovered long before anyone understood germ theory. So, instead of reaching for the communal well bucket, you'd likely be looking for something else to quench your thirst. The undisputed king of everyday medieval beverages, especially in Northern Europe, was ale. Not the hopped, clear, carbonated beer you might find in a modern pub, but a thick, often cloudy, relatively low-alcohol brew made from grain, usually barley or oats, and water. Hops weren't widely used for bittering and preservation until later in the medieval period, especially in England, so earlier ale was sweeter and didn't last as long. This meant it was often brewed frequently, sometimes even daily, in households and by professional brewers. Everyone drank ale. Men, women, children, yes, even children. The alcohol content was usually low, perhaps 1 to 3%, making it more like a slightly alcoholic, liquid bread than a potent spirit. It provided calories, hydration, and was generally safer than water. You'd drink it with every meal, during work breaks, and probably just whenever you felt thirsty. Imagine sipping on something that looks a bit like murky soup but tastes vaguely of warm grain and, well, whatever else might have gotten into the brewing vat. Cheers! Walking through the town, you'd see alehouses, early pubs, and vendors selling ale by the cup or jug. It was cheap, ubiquitous, and essential to daily life. The quality varied wildly, from decent, freshly brewed stuff to sour, stale swill that might still give you a dodgy stomach, but at least it was less likely to kill you than the river water. It was the medieval equivalent of bottled water or soda, your go-to, everyday drink. In regions where grapes grew well, wine was also a common drink, though its quality and affordability varied. Much of the wine consumed by the poor and middle classes was likely young, rough, and often diluted. Imported wines from places like France were expensive and reserved for the wealthy. But local wine, or even piquette, a low-alcohol drink made from pressing the leftover grape skins and seeds after the first wine was made, would be available. Wine was another safer alternative to water due to its alcohol content. Cider, made from fermented apples, was popular in apple-growing regions like parts of England and France. Like ale, it was a low-alcohol, calorie-rich drink that was safer than water. Perry, made from pears, was another regional variation. These fruit-based drinks added a bit more variety to the medieval liquid diet. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for drinking ale, wine, and cider was purely for safety due to water quality, or if people genuinely preferred the taste and caloric content. It was likely a combination of both, with safety being a significant factor, but the pleasant buzz and nutritional values certainly didn't hurt either. Plus, let's be honest, fermented drinks are just more fun sometimes, even low-alcohol ones. A quirky tidbit about medieval drinking: there was a concept of small ale or table beer, which was brewed to be even weaker than standard ale, specifically for children and for drinking copious amounts throughout the day without getting too intoxicated. It was essentially liquid calories and hydration, barely alcoholic at all, but still safer than water. Imagine giving your kids a 6-pack of small ale today. Probably wouldn't fly. Beyond the big three, ale, wine, cider, there were other, less common drinks. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was highly prized, but honey could be expensive, so it wasn't an everyday drink for most. Milk was usually consumed fresh or turned into cheese and butter, as it spoiled quickly. Fruit juices existed but weren't fermented, so they had the same shelf life and potential contamination issues as water unless they were consumed immediately. The prevalence of these fermented drinks meant that medieval people consumed a surprising amount of alcohol by modern standards, even if it was low proof. They weren't necessarily drunk all the time, though that certainly happened, but a constant low level of alcohol would have been present in their systems. It was just part of the daily routine, as normal as drinking water is for us today. Mainstream historical fact time. In medieval England, ale was so central to the diet and economy that its price and quality were often regulated by local authorities. Ale tasters were appointed to ensure it met certain standards, and alewives, women who brewed and sold ale, were common figures in towns and villages. Brewing was largely a female domain for much of the period. So, as you finish your greasy pie and look for something to drink, you're not reaching for a cold bottle of spring water. You're likely heading towards an alehouse, or finding a vendor with a barrel, ready to ladle out a cup of cloudy, warm, slightly alcoholic ale. It's the medieval equivalent of grabbing a soda or a coffee, but with a much higher chance of sediment at the bottom and a lower chance of typhoid. It's the necessary liquid companion to all that heavy, fatty food you've been eating. It washes down the grease, provides some calories, and keeps you, relatively, safe from the perils of medieval hydration. Just try not to think too hard about the brewing conditions. Ignorance is bliss, remember? Now, bottoms up. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Don't want to spill on that questionable tunic. So, you've had your fill of greasy pies, questionable roasted birds, and chased it all down with some cloudy, low-alcohol ale. Your stomach is full, perhaps a little uneasy, and you're starting to get a sense of the sheer density of medieval street food. But there's one crucial element we haven't fully explored yet, something that could elevate even the simplest pea pottage or a humble fritter into something truly special, something that hinted at wealth and exotic lands, spices. Today, we think of spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and pepper as common pantry staples, readily available at any supermarket for a few dollars. In the medieval world, however, these weren't just flavorings. They were luxury goods, precious commodities transported over vast distances along treacherous trade routes. Think of them like edible gold dust, arriving from the mysterious East, controlled by merchants who guarded their sources and prices fiercely. The cost of these spices was astronomical by medieval standards. A pound of ginger could cost as much as a sheep, and saffron, derived from the delicate stigmas of a crocus flower, was often worth more than its weight in gold. Seriously, imagine paying the price of a small car for a jar of saffron threads today. That's the kind of expense we're talking about. Because they were so expensive, spices weren't just sprinkled casually onto food. They were symbols of status and wealth. If you could afford to put liberal amounts of ginger and cinnamon in your pie, you were definitely showing off. The truly wealthy would use them in abundance, creating complex, highly spiced dishes that were a world away from the simple fare of the poor. But even on the street, a vendor might add a pinch of precious spice to a batch of fritters or a meat filling to make it more appealing and justify a slightly higher price. It was the medieval equivalent of adding truffle oil or gold leaf to a dish, pure indulgence and bragging rights. The flavors these spices brought were intense and often used in combinations that might seem strange to us now. Sweet and savory were frequently mixed, with spices like cinnamon and ginger appearing in meat dishes as often as in desserts. Cloves added a pungent warmth, while pepper, though less refined than modern black pepper, provided a sharp bite. Saffron wasn't just for color, it imparted a unique, slightly metallic, honeyed flavor that was highly prized. Imagine a meat pie heavily spiced with ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, perhaps with a touch of saffron, a far cry from a simple steak and kidney pie today. Historians still argue whether spices were primarily used to mask the taste of meat that might be slightly past its prime, or if their main purpose was simply to add desirable and fashionable flavors. It's likely a bit of both. While spices certainly could cover up less than fresh notes, Their high cost suggests they were valued for their own sake and the prestige they conferred. Nobody would spend a sheep's worth of ginger just to make rotten meat edible. They just eat less rotten meat. Probably. Beyond flavor, some spices were believed to have medicinal properties or aid digestion, fitting into the medieval understanding of food as medicine that we'll touch on later. Warm spices like ginger and cinnamon were thought to heat the body and help process rich, heavy foods. This might have been a practical belief, given the fat-heavy diet, or just another layer of mystique surrounding these exotic ingredients. Other flavorings were more local and less expensive. Herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme were grown in gardens and used to add freshness and depth to dishes. Onions and garlic were common staples, providing pungent base flavors. Salt was crucial, not just for taste but also as a primary preservative, essential for curing meats and fish. But it was the imported spices that truly transformed a dish from ordinary to extraordinary, signaling sophistication and a connection to the wider world. Think about those street vendors selling pies or fritters. Adding a bit of ginger or cinnamon to their batter or filling could make their offering stand out in a crowded market. It was a way to add perceived value and appeal, even if the base ingredients were humble. A sweet fritter made with just honey and flour was one thing. One spiced with cinnamon and ginger felt like a luxurious treat, even if it was still fried in the same questionable fat. It's like the difference between a plain donut and a spiced apple cider donut. The spices elevate the experience. A quirky tidbit about medieval spices: sometimes, less common or even non-culinary spices were used. Grains of paradise, a relative of ginger from West Africa, provided a peppery, cardamom-like flavor and were quite popular. Cubebs, small dried fruits related to black pepper, had a piney, peppery taste. And sometimes spices were used in such large quantities that the flavor profile of a dish was almost entirely dominated by them, rather than the underlying ingredients. Imagine a dish that tasted only of ginger and cloves, with the meat or vegetables playing a supporting role. The trade in spices was a major economic driver, shaping alliances, funding voyages, and creating immense wealth for merchants and rulers who controlled the routes. Venice and Genoa became powerful city-states largely on the back of the spice trade. When you bought a small bag of pepper from a street vendor, you were participating, however indirectly, in a global network of commerce and exploration. Your simple pie wasn't just food, it was a tiny link in a chain stretching all the way to India or the Spice Islands. The use of spices also highlights the contrast between the theoretical availability of ingredients and the practical reality for most people. While cookbooks of the time describe elaborate, heavily spiced dishes, these were for the elite. The average person might only encounter imported spices on rare occasions or in very small quantities, perhaps in a festive ale or a special pie. The street food we're discussing offered a slightly more accessible way to taste these exotic flavors, albeit often in simpler forms and mixed with less refined ingredients. It was a democratizing force, bringing a hint of luxury to the common folk, even if that hint was just a whisper of cinnamon in a greasy fried dough ball. So, as you finish your spice fritter, feeling the warmth of the ginger and cinnamon lingering on your tongue, remember that you're tasting more than just sugar and fat. You're tasting history, trade, status, and a world where flavor was both a necessity and a profound luxury. It adds another layer to that medieval street scene, the aromas not just of cooking food, but of distant lands and expensive treasures arriving piece by precious piece to make even the humblest snack feel a little bit magical. Or at least, a little bit more interesting than just plain old cooked grain. You've tasted the spice, felt the buzz of the low-alcohol ale, and your fingers are probably still a little sticky from the fritters and greasy from the meat pie. And if there's one thing that ties all these medieval street food experiences together, one common thread running through the sizzling braziers and the thick pastry crusts, it's this: medieval people really loved fat. And they used a lot of it. A lot. Forget your modern low-fat diets or your concerns about saturated fats. In the medieval world, fat was your friend. It was flavor, it was energy, and it was essential. Think back to those fritters being deep-fried right there on the street. What were they fried in? Bubbling fat. Those roasted meats dripping over the coals? Drips of pure, rendered fat, often collected and used for other cooking. The fillings of those pies? Often mixed with extra fat to make them richer and more filling. Fat wasn't just a cooking medium. It was a core ingredient, embraced for its ability to transform simple ingredients into something substantial and delicious. The most common types of fat used were animal fats: lard, rendered pork fat, suet, hard fat found around the kidneys of beef or mutton, and dripping, fat rendered from roasted meats. Butter was also used, but could be more expensive and wasn't always available, especially for the poor. Vegetable oils like olive oil were common in the Mediterranean, but less so in Northern Europe, where animal husbandry was more dominant. So, for our imaginary stroll through a Northern European town, you're mostly smelling and tasting the richness of rendered animal fat. Why so much fat? Several reasons. First and foremost, calories. Medieval life was physically demanding for most people. Laborers, farmers, craftspeople, they all needed a massive amount of energy just to get through the day. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient, providing 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for protein and carbohydrates. Loading up food with fat was a highly efficient way to get the energy needed to swing a hammer, plow a field, or haul goods around town. It was fuel for the medieval engine. Your body wasn't worried about hitting a certain macro split, it just needed energy, and fat delivered it in spades. Second, flavor and texture. Fat carries flavor compounds and provides a satisfying richness and mouthfeel that leaner cooking methods just can't replicate. Frying in fat creates crispy exteriors and moist interiors. Adding fat to pie fillings makes them succulent. Roasting meat with its fat keeps it from drying out and adds a deep, savory taste. It made food taste good, plain and simple. And in a world where the underlying ingredients might be monotonous or less than perfect quality, fat was a flavor enhancer par excellence. It could even help mask less desirable tastes, though perhaps not as effectively as those expensive spices we just talked about. Third, preservation. While not its primary function, fat helped preserve food to some extent. Meat cooked and sealed in a thick pastry crust with plenty of fat would last longer than cooked meat left exposed to the air. Rendering fat itself was a way to preserve it for later use, creating a stable cooking medium that wouldn't spoil as quickly as fresh meat or butter. Imagine a vendor selling those pea fritters. They aren't just mixing peas and flour, they're likely mixing them into a batter that might include eggs and milk, if available, and then dropping spoonfuls into a vat of hot, shimmering lard. The smell of that hot fat alone would be incredibly enticing, a primal call to a hungry body seeking energy. The resulting fritters would be crispy on the outside, soft and yielding within, and incredibly rich. They weren't just a snack, they were a calorie bomb, designed to sustain you. Historians still argue whether the medieval preference for fat was solely driven by caloric necessity and flavor, or if there were also cultural or humoral reasons influencing its heavy use. Medieval medicine, based on the ancient Greek concept of humors, often categorized foods by their properties: hot, cold, wet, dry. Fatty foods were often seen as hot and moist, believed to be good for digestion and providing warmth, especially in colder climates. A quirky tidbit about medieval fat use: sometimes, clarified fat, like dripping or lard, was used almost like a condiment or spread. Instead of butter on your bread, you might smear it with rendered fat, especially if you were poor and butter was too expensive. It was a cheap way to add calories and flavor to the staple bread. Imagine a slice of dark, dense rye bread slathered with warm beef dripping. Not exactly a modern toast experience, but highly functional. This heavy reliance on fat had consequences, of course. While it provided much-needed energy, the sheer amount of saturated fat and the lack of fiber in many of these fast foods likely contributed to digestive issues, as we've hinted. Your medieval gut was working overtime to process all that richness. And while they didn't have the same understanding of heart disease we do today, a diet consistently high in animal fats, combined with less varied fresh produce, especially in winter, certainly presented its own set of health challenges. But for the person needing to get through a day of hard physical labor, the immediate benefit of those dense calories far outweighed any potential long-term risks they weren't even aware of. It was a pragmatic choice born of necessity. Think about the contrast with modern diets. We often try to minimize fat, especially animal fats, view them with suspicion, and opt for lean cuts of meat or low-fat versions of foods. The medieval mindset was the opposite: the fattier, the better. Fat was desirable, a sign of richness and sustenance. A nice layer of fat on your meat wasn't something to be trimmed away. It was a bonus, a source of energy and flavor to be celebrated. It's like the medieval equivalent of finding extra cheese on your pizza. Pure bonus calories and deliciousness. The process of rendering fat was a common household and professional activity. When an animal was slaughtered, the fat would be carefully collected and slowly heated in a pot until it melted and separated from any tissue. This rendered fat could then be stored for future use, a valuable resource that wasn't wasted. Street vendors would likely buy rendered fat in bulk, keeping a pot constantly heated to churn out fried goods. The same fat might be used repeatedly throughout the day, adding layers of flavor, and potentially other things, to whatever was being cooked. This repeated heating would break down the fat and create compounds that contributed to the unique taste and smell of medieval street food. Mainstream historical fact time: due to religious restrictions on eating meat on certain days, fast days, often Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and throughout Lent, medieval cooks had to find alternative sources of fat for cooking. In coastal and fish-rich areas, fish oil was sometimes used, but in many inland regions, vegetable oils like nut oils or linseed oil were employed, or they simply relied more heavily on pulses and grains cooked without added fat on those days. This dietary rhythm meant that the type of fat used could even change depending on the day of the week or the time of year. So, as you wipe the grease from your chin, contemplating that extra rich bite of pie filling, know that you are experiencing the medieval world's enthusiastic embrace of fat. It wasn't just an ingredient. It was a cornerstone of their diet, a vital source of energy, flavor, and comfort. It powered their bodies, made their food taste richer, and left an indelible mark on the culinary landscape. It's the taste of pure, unadulterated calorie density, served hot and greasy on the go. And while your modern stomach might be staging a quiet rebellion, your medieval self would be giving a satisfied, fat-fueled burp of approval. So, you're probably feeling pretty full, maybe a little queasy, and definitely coated in a thin film of medieval grease. All that fat, all that rich meat, all those dense fritters. And while those things were certainly key players in the medieval fast food scene, providing quick energy and flavor, none of it would have been possible without the absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet: bread. It wasn't just a food, it was the food. The base, the filler, the constant companion to almost every meal, every snack, every bite. Imagine it: you're walking down that street, past the sizzling meat and the bubbling fat, and there it is, the smell of baking bread. It's warm, it's comforting, it's the smell of survival and sustenance. Medieval bread wasn't like the soft, airy loaves you find sliced neatly in plastic bags today. Oh no. Medieval bread came in a million different forms and qualities, and its type told you everything you needed to know about the person eating it. At the top of the bread hierarchy was white bread, often called manchet in England. This was made from the finest, most refined wheat flour, carefully sieved to remove the bran and germ. It was lighter in texture, whiter in color, though still probably not as bleached white as modern bread, and incredibly expensive. Eating fine white bread was a clear signal of wealth and status. It required good land to grow wheat, the resources to mill and sift the flour properly, and the money to buy it. For most people grabbing food on the street, this wasn't their daily bread. Below the pristine white loaves were various grades of darker bread. As you moved down the social ladder, the bread got coarser, darker, and heavier. It was made from less refined wheat flour, or mixtures of wheat with other grains like rye, barley, or oats. The bran and germ were often left in, making it more nutritious, though they didn't think of it that way, and much tougher. This was the bread of the common people, the laborers, the poor. It was dense, often soured or leavened, yeast wasn't always readily available or understood, and could be quite hard, especially when stale. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a brick, but edible. Just barely. Historians still argue whether the nutritional advantages of darker, wholemeal bread were recognized or valued in the medieval period, or if white bread was universally preferred purely for its perceived purity, status, and easier texture. It seems clear that white bread was the aspirational standard, associated with the refined palate of the wealthy, while the darker, coarser breads were the practical reality for most, valued for their filling nature and affordability. The sheer volume of bread consumed was staggering. For the average medieval person, bread could account for 70 to 80% of their daily calorie intake. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine eating bread for 3/4 of your calories every single day. That meat pie. It likely had a thick bread crust and was eaten with more bread. That pottage? Mopped up with bread. That ale? Liquid bread, basically. You were a bread-eating machine. Your jaw muscles would be incredible, assuming your teeth survived. A quirky tidbit about medieval bread: sometimes, especially in wealthier households, bread was used not just for eating but as a plate. A thick slice of stale bread, called a trencher, would be placed on the table, and the food would be piled on top. As you ate the meat or stew, the bread would soak up the juices. After the meal, the gravy-soaked trenchers were often given to the poor or fed to the dogs. So, the bread literally served as disposable dinnerware. Talk about zero waste. Though again, probably less common for the guy grabbing a pie on the street. Street vendors would sell bread plain, hot from small ovens or braziers, or use it as the base for other snacks. You might find pieces of bread topped with cheese, or dipped in fat and fried, the medieval equivalent of a grilled cheese or fried bread. It was the ultimate flexible food item. Cheap, filling, and capable of soaking up any sauce or grease you threw at it. Remember all that fat we talked about? Bread was the perfect vehicle for getting it into your system. Slathering fat on a piece of dark bread was a common way for the poor to add crucial calories to their diet. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The process of making bread was fundamental. Grain had to be grown, harvested, threshed, and milled. Milling was a significant undertaking, often done at communal mills powered by water or wind, where the miller would take a portion of the grain as payment, the miller's toll. Then the flour was mixed with water, leaven, either saved sourdough starter or, later, yeast skimmed from brewing ale, salted, kneaded, and baked. Baking was often done in communal ovens or large household ovens, requiring significant fuel like wood. For street vendors, having access to an oven or a way to bake small loaves or pieces quickly was essential. The quality control for bread could be surprisingly stringent, at least officially. The assize of bread and ale, a law first established in England in the 13th century, regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale based on the price of grain. Bakers who cheated their customers by making loaves too small or of poor quality could face severe penalties, including being put in the pillory. This was because bread was such a vital part of people's survival. Messing with it was a serious offense. Imagine going to jail today for selling a slightly undersized loaf of sourdough. Medieval authorities didn't mess around when it came to their staple food. Jokes about medieval bread often revolve around its toughness. You might hear tales of loaves so hard they could be used as weapons, or so dense they'd sink in water. While probably exaggerated, it highlights the reality that for most people, bread was a sturdy, no-nonsense food designed for function over finesse. It wasn't meant to be a light, fluffy treat. It was meant to fill your belly and keep you going. It was the original energy bar, just made from grain and elbow grease. The different grains used also impacted the taste and texture. Rye bread, common in parts of northern Europe, was dense, dark, and had a distinct, slightly sour flavor. Barley bread was even heavier and less palatable. Mixing grains was common to stretch the more expensive wheat flour or to make use of whatever was available. This meant the bread you bought could be a mix of several different grains, leading to a highly variable product. You never quite knew what you were going to get, but you knew it was going to be filling. Mainstream historical fact time: bread was so important that the baker was a highly respected, albeit sometimes viewed with suspicion, due to potential cheating, member of the community. The process of baking was central to urban and rural life, involving significant labor and infrastructure, from the mills to the ovens. Access to affordable, reliable bread was a major concern for medieval governments, leading to regulations like the assize. So, as you finished that last crumb of your medieval snack, whether it was a pie crust or a piece of bread used to soak up dripping, remember the humble loaf. It was the foundation of the medieval diet, the fuel that powered their world, and the base upon which many of their fast foods were built. It was often tough, sometimes questionable in quality, but always essential. You might complain about stale bread today, but after a day of medieval life, you'd probably be eternally grateful for any piece you could get your hands on, white, brown, or somewhere in between. Just try not to break a tooth. Okay, so you've navigated the bustling, smelly streets, sampled the fried dough and the meaty pies, and washed it all down with some hazy ale, feeling the dense weight of all that bread settling in your belly. You've experienced the grab-and-go options of the medieval town dweller. But what if you weren't staying put? What if you were a merchant traveling to the next market town, a pilgrim heading to a holy site, or a messenger carrying important news? You couldn't rely on finding a street vendor with hot fritters every time your stomach rumbled, especially out on the dusty roads or through dark forests. This is where the world of medieval travelers' rations and snacks comes in. Food designed not for immediate gratification, but for survival on the go. Imagine packing for a journey. You don't have freeze-dried meals or protein bars. You need food that won't spoil quickly, can be eaten cold or with minimal preparation, and is dense enough to provide energy without taking up too much space. The primary concern was preservation. Without refrigeration, food went bad fast, especially meat and dairy. So, travelers relied on methods that extended shelf life, drying, smoking, salting, and baking things until they were practically indestructible. The absolute staple of the medieval traveler's pack was hard biscuit, or ship's biscuit. Think of it as the great-great-great-grandfather of a modern hardtack, but perhaps even less appetizing. This was bread baked not once, but often twice or even 3 times, until it was rock hard and completely dry. The lack of moisture meant it wouldn't mold or spoil, making it ideal for long journeys by land or sea. It was incredibly durable. You could probably hammer a nail with it. Eating it required serious effort, often needing to be soaked in water, ale, or stew to make it even remotely chewable. It wasn't delicious, but it was calories and it wouldn't kill you, unless you broke a tooth on it, which was a distinct possibility. It was the ultimate functional food, the medieval equivalent of an emergency survival bar, designed purely for sustenance when nothing else was available. Alongside the brick-like biscuits, travelers would carry preserved meats. Meat could be salted or smoked to extend its life. Salt pork or beef, often dried after salting, was a common option. Smoked sausages or cured hams also made good travel food. These meats were incredibly salty and often tough, but they provided vital protein and fat. You'd gnaw on a piece of dried meat, perhaps rehydrated slightly in your drink, getting a burst of salt and protein. It wasn't a gourmet experience, but it kept you going when miles lay between you and the next potential meal. Fish was also preserved, especially in areas near the coast or major rivers. Dried and salted cod, known as stockfish, was particularly common for travel and fasting days. It was incredibly hard and required prolonged soaking and pounding before cooking, but for a traveler, a piece could be slowly chewed on for sustenance. Smoked fish was another option, offering a different flavor profile but the same benefit of extended shelf life. Imagine pulling a piece of leathery, intensely salty dried fish out of your pack for lunch. Delicious, said no medieval traveler, probably. Cheese was another portable food source, though softer cheeses wouldn't last long. Hard, aged cheeses, however, could withstand a journey relatively well. They provided fat, protein, and calories in a compact form. A chunk of hard cheese, gnawed on alongside a piece of rock-hard biscuit, was a common traveler's meal. It was simple, energy-dense, and didn't require any cooking. For a touch of sweetness or variety, travelers might carry dried fruit like apples, pears, figs, or dates, depending on what was available regionally and seasonally. Nuts were also a good option, non-perishable, calorie-rich, and easy to carry. These provided a welcome change from the monotonous diet of hard biscuits and salty meat, and offered a quicker energy boost. Honey, sealed in a jar or beeswax, was also a portable sweetener and energy source, though it was heavy to carry. Historians still argue whether the average medieval traveler carried significant amounts of food with them or relied more heavily on finding provisions along the way at inns, monasteries, or villages. It likely depended on the length and nature of the journey, the wealth of the traveler, and the known availability of stops. A short trip might require only a day's worth of biscuit and cheese, while a long pilgrimage would necessitate a more substantial, carefully planned ration pack. The process of preparing these rations was focused entirely on durability. Biscuits were baked until all moisture was gone. Meat and fish were heavily salted or smoked to prevent bacterial growth. These methods often resulted in food that was incredibly tough, dry, and intensely flavored, usually with salt or smoke. Palatability was a secondary concern to survival. You weren't eating for pleasure, you were eating to not starve before you reached your destination. A quirky tidbit about travelers' food: some travelers might carry small amounts of dried herbs or spices to try and make their monotonous rations slightly more palatable, or perhaps for medicinal purposes on the road. A pinch of ginger or a sprig of dried thyme could make that rehydrated salt meat feel a little less like punishment. It was a small luxury in a diet of harsh necessities. These rations highlight the stark contrast between the relatively varied, though still limited by modern standards, street food available in towns and the much more basic, survival-oriented food needed for travel. On the road, you traded convenience and any semblance of freshness for longevity and portability. You weren't looking for a hot, greasy pie, you were looking for something that wouldn't kill you and would provide enough energy to walk another 10 miles. Mainstream historical fact time: monasteries often served as informal inns and resting places for travelers, especially pilgrims. They would provide simple meals, often consisting of bread, ale, cheese, and perhaps pottage or dried fish on fast days. Relying on monastic hospitality was a common way for less wealthy travelers to find sustenance without having to carry large amounts of provisions or pay for expensive inns. The physical reality of eating these rations was also different. You weren't standing on a street corner popping fritters. You were likely sitting by the side of a road, or in a drafty inn, or perhaps even chewing a piece of hard biscuit as you walked. It was fueling up out of necessity, not enjoying a quick treat. Your jaw would ache from the chewing, your mouth would be dry from the salt, and you'd probably be dreaming of the next time you could stop somewhere with a fire and a pot to make something warm and slightly softer. So, as you picture the medieval world, don't just think of the bustling town streets. Think also of the long, arduous roads, and the travelers moving along them, sustained by food that was the antithesis of fresh or convenient. Hard biscuits, salty meat, dried fish. These were the snacks of survival, the fuel for journeys in a world where getting from point A to point B was a serious undertaking. It makes that greasy street pie seem like a feast in comparison, doesn't it? It puts a whole new perspective on packing a lunch. So, you've experienced the reality of medieval travel food, the jaw-breaking biscuits, the eye-watering salt meat, the sheer functionality of it all, designed purely to keep you alive on the road. If that represents one end of the medieval food spectrum, necessity, survival, basic fuel, then a medieval banquet represents the absolute, glittering, extravagant opposite. Forget your hardtack and your dried fish. Imagine stepping out of the dusty road and straight into a hall draped with tapestries, filled with the sound of music and laughter, and tables groaning under the weight of more food than you've ever seen in your life. This is where medieval junk food, or rather, medieval excess food, reached its most extreme, a world away from the street vendor's brazier. This wasn't just a meal, it was a performance, a display of wealth, power, and culinary skill designed to impress, awe, and perhaps slightly overwhelm the guests. While the average person was gnawing on dark bread and making do with pottage, the elite were feasting on dozens of courses, each more elaborate and visually stunning than the last. If street food was the medieval equivalent of a quick hot dog, a banquet was like a 20-course avant-garde tasting menu where half the dishes were made of gold leaf and shaped like mythical creatures. The sheer quantity of food was staggering. Forget portion control, this was about abundance. Tables would be piled high with roasted meats, whole boars, deer, swans, peacocks, often redressed in their feathers after cooking for dramatic effect. There would be vast pies, much larger and more decorative than the handheld street versions, sometimes containing live birds, yes, really, like in the nursery rhyme, or multiple types of meat mixed together. Fish dishes, even on non-fasting days, would be present in variety, often elaborately prepared. But it wasn't just about quantity, it was about spectacle. Cooks, often highly skilled professionals, would transform ingredients into edible art. Meat might be dyed vibrant colors using saffron, Section 5 callback, madder, or other pigments. Dishes would be molded into fanciful shapes. Sugar, Section 2 callback, that incredibly expensive luxury, would be used to create elaborate sculptures called subtleties, edible centerpieces depicting castles, ships, or mythological scenes, designed purely for show and removed before they could be eaten by anyone but the wealthiest. It was food designed to be admired, not just consumed. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these elaborate displays was nutritional sustenance or purely social and political theater. While the food was certainly eaten, the emphasis on presentation, rarity of ingredients, and sheer excess suggests that demonstrating wealth and power was a major driving force. You weren't just feeding your guests, you were showing them you could afford to turn precious spices into colored dyes and bake entire swans. The types of meats served were often more exotic than the street fare, Section 3 callback. While chicken and pork were present, banquets featured game birds, wild boar, venison, and even marine mammals like porpoises or dolphins, which were classified as fish and therefore acceptable on fast days. Imagine presenting a whole roasted porpoise at your modern dinner party. Might raise a few eyebrows. In the medieval court, it was just Tuesday. The use of spices, Section 5 callback, in these banquets was prolific, bordering on excessive by modern tastes. Dishes would be intensely flavored with ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, often combined in ways that seem unusual today, like heavily spiced sweet and sour meat stews. The spices weren't just for flavor. Their expense added another layer to the display of wealth. A dish wasn't just tasty, it was costly tasty. A quirky tidbit about medieval banquets: one popular dish was blancmange, not the wobbly dessert we know today, but a savory dish made from shredded chicken or fish, milk or almond milk, rice, and sugar or honey, often spiced and colored. It was considered a highly refined and easily digestible food, often served as a palate cleanser or for those who were ill, but it was also a staple of banquets, sometimes molded into elaborate shapes and decorated with gilded almonds. Imagine eating a savory, sweet chicken pudding as a sign of high status. Drinks at a banquet were similarly elevated. While low-alcohol ale, Section 4 callback, was still present, the focus would be on fine wines, often imported and heavily spiced or sweetened. Mead and other specialty brews might also be served. The quality and variety of drinks matched the food, emphasizing the host's ability to acquire the best from near and far. You weren't just drinking to avoid contaminated water, you were drinking vintages that cost a fortune. The sheer richness and variety of the food, combined with the lack of understanding of proper food combining, by our standards, and the copious amounts of drink, likely led to some impressive digestive distress even among the wealthy. While street food might give you the squirts, Section 1 callback, a banquet could leave you feeling like you'd swallowed a brick made of fat, sugar, and peacock feathers. Medieval advice often included taking digestive aids or ending the meal with something like spiced wine or comfits, sugar-coated seeds or nuts, another use of expensive sugar, believed to aid digestion. Or perhaps you just hoped for the best and blamed any discomfort on the humors being out of balance. The contrast with the everyday diet, particularly the traveler's rations, is stark. While the poor and travelers ate food designed for survival and sustenance, the rich ate food designed for pleasure, status, and spectacle. It highlights the massive inequality of the medieval world, where access to food wasn't just about getting enough calories, but about demonstrating one's place in society. The street vendor's pie was fuel, the banquet's gilded peacock was power. Mainstream historical fact time. Medieval banquets often followed a specific structure, with courses brought out in elaborate processions, sometimes accompanied by music or theatrical performances. The seating arrangements were strictly hierarchical, reflecting the social status of the guests. The host would sit at the high table, and guests would be seated in descending order of importance, with the food and service reflecting these distinctions. These feasts weren't an everyday occurrence, even for the wealthy. They were reserved for special occasions, holidays, weddings, visits by important guests, or celebrations of military victories. But they represented the pinnacle of medieval culinary aspiration, a world where food was not just sustenance but a form of entertainment, a canvas for artistic expression, and a powerful tool for social and political maneuvering. It makes that humble street fritter seem even more basic, doesn't it? But perhaps, in its own way, just as satisfying in the moment. At least you didn't have to worry about accidentally eating a dolphin. So, you've navigated the extremes of medieval eating, from the functional toughness of travelers' rations to the gilded excess of a banquet. You've felt the weight of all that fat and bread, maybe contemplated the potential digestive fallout. But medieval people didn't just eat for sustenance, taste, or even status. They ate because they believed food had a profound effect on their health, their mood, and even their destiny. In a world before germ theory or nutritional science as we know it, diet was inextricably linked to medicine and superstition. Imagine experiencing a stomachache after that greasy meat pie, Section 3 callback, or feeling sluggish after a banquet, Section 9 callback. Your first thought wouldn't be, too much saturated fat. Instead, you'd likely think about the balance of your humors. Medieval medicine was heavily influenced by ancient Greek ideas, particularly the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were associated with qualities hot, cold, wet, dry, and temperaments: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic. Health was a matter of keeping these humors in balance, and diet was one of the primary tools for achieving this equilibrium. Every food, drink, and spice was classified according to its humoral properties. Ale, Section 4 callback, might be considered hot and wet, while dried fish, Section 8 callback, was cold and dry. Spices, Section 5 callback, almost without exception, were seen as hot and dry, which is one reason they were so popular, especially in colder climates, or when eating cold or wet foods like fish or vegetables. If you felt you had too much cold phlegm, you'd eat hot foods like heavily spiced meat or ginger fritters, Section 2 callback, to balance things out. Feeling too hot and dry from excess yellow bile? You might be advised to eat cooling, moist foods like lettuce or cucumbers, though fresh vegetables weren't always a huge part of the diet, especially for the poor. It was a complex system of dietary prescriptions aimed at maintaining internal harmony. This humoral framework influenced everything from daily meals to remedies for illness. If you had a fever, seen as an excess of heat, you'd be given cooling foods. If you had a cold, excessive cold and wet, you'd be prescribed hot, dry foods and spices. Cooks and physicians, often the same people, or working closely together, would select ingredients and cooking methods not just for taste, but for their perceived impact on the body's humoral balance. That preference for fatty, spiced, hot foods wasn't just about flavor. It was also a deliberate attempt to warm and dry the body, counteracting the perceived cold and wet influences of the environment and certain other foods. It's like the medieval version of choosing chicken soup when you have a cold, but based on a much more elaborate, and to us strange, classification system. Historians still argue whether humoral theory was genuinely the primary driver of medieval dietary choices, or if practical concerns like availability, cost, and taste played a much larger role, with the humoral justifications often applied retrospectively. It's likely a mix, with the theory providing a framework for understanding and discussing food and health, even if daily choices were often dictated by necessity. Beyond the formal medical theories, food was also steeped in superstition and folklore. Certain foods were believed to bring good or bad luck. Eating specific dishes on certain days might be tied to religious or pagan traditions. For instance, fasting days were observed not just for religious penance, but also because fish and water foods were seen as cold and moist, contrasting with the hot and dry properties of meat, creating a dietary rhythm believed to be healthy. Breaking a fast could involve specific rituals or foods to ease the body back into eating meat. Food ingredients themselves could be seen as having magical or protective properties. Garlic, for example, was valued not just for its flavor but also for its strong smell, believed to ward off evil spirits or illness. Certain herbs added to dishes might be intended as much for protection or luck as for taste. The act of baking bread, Section 7 callback, was often surrounded by rituals and prayers, recognizing its vital importance and the potential for things to go wrong. A loaf that didn't rise properly might be seen as a bad omen, not just a baking failure. Remember sugar being used as medicine, Section 2 callback. This fits perfectly into the humoral framework. Sugar was considered hot and moist, and was prescribed for various ailments, often mixed with spices or herbs. Its high cost also contributed to its status as a potent medicine. If it was expensive, it must be powerful, right? It was used to coat bitter pills, soothe throats, and was generally seen as strengthening and restorative. Imagine your doctor prescribing you a spoonful of pure sugar for your cough. A quirky tidbit about medieval food superstition. There was a belief that food prepared by certain people could have different effects. For example, food prepared by women might be seen as more nurturing, while food prepared by monks might be considered particularly pure or even blessed. The hands that prepared your street pie, Section 1 callback, weren't just about hygiene. They might also be believed to impart certain qualities, good or bad, to the food itself. Probably best not to think too hard about whose hands prepared that eel on a stick. This blend of medical theory and folklore meant that eating was rarely just about satisfying hunger. It was a constant negotiation with the body, the environment, and the unseen forces believed to influence health and fortune. Every bite of that dense bread, every sip of that ale, every piece of spiced meat was potentially altering your humoral balance, inviting good luck, or warding off illness. It added a layer of complexity and significance to even the most mundane meal. It also meant that food advice could be wildly different from what we hear today. Instead of counting calories or worrying about cholesterol, you'd be advised to eat foods that matched your temperament, or the season, to avoid mixing foods with conflicting humoral properties, and perhaps to eat a specific herb to protect you from the plague. Your medieval doctor might tell you to eat more hot, dry ginger, while your modern doctor tells you to eat less greasy, fatty food. Different worlds, different worries. Mainstream historical fact time. The Galenic system of medicine, based on the humors, was the dominant medical framework in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period. Physicians, relying on texts from ancient Greek and Arab scholars, would diagnose illnesses based on imbalances of the humors and prescribe treatments, including dietary changes, to restore balance. So, as you digest your imaginary medieval meal, remember that you weren't just filling your belly. You were engaging in a complex interplay of humoral theory, folklore, and practical necessity. Your food choices, whether a quick street snack or a formal banquet dish, were seen as directly impacting your physical and even spiritual well-being. It adds a whole new dimension to the idea of comfort food or a healthy diet, medieval style. It was food as medicine, food as magic, food as the very stuff of life, understood through a lens that is both fascinatingly alien and surprisingly relatable in its desire to connect what we eat with how we feel. So, you've contemplated the humors, considered the magic, and perhaps felt a phantom pang of indigestion from all that rich, fatty, medieval goodness. But let's pivot slightly from what they ate and why they thought it affected them, to how that food actually made it from field or farm to your hand or plate. And this is where we have to talk about something less appealing, something that often gets glossed over in romanticized visions of the past: cleanliness. Or, perhaps more accurately, the distinct lack of it by modern standards. Imagine that bustling street scene again, call back to Section 1. The mud, the animals wandering freely, the open drains serving as sewers. Seriously, dodging sewage was a daily skill. Now picture a food vendor in the middle of all that. They're handling raw meat, maybe wiping their hands on their apron, which has probably seen better centuries, using water from a potentially questionable source, call back to section 4 about water quality, and dealing with flies and other pests attracted to the food and the general environment. It's probably safe to say that medieval food preparation areas were not operating under strict public health guidelines involving stainless steel surfaces and antibacterial soap. The concept of hygiene as we understand it, the deliberate practice of sanitation to prevent the spread of germs and illness, simply didn't exist. People knew that filth was unpleasant and could sometimes make you sick, but they didn't understand why. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. So, while they might rinse something off, their efforts were likely more about removing visible dirt than eliminating microscopic pathogens. That greasy fat, call back to section 6, that the fritters were fried in? It was probably used repeatedly, day after day, not just adding flavor but also potentially harboring all sorts of delightful microorganisms. The thick crust of the pies, call back to section 3, might have protected the filling from some airborne nasties, but the hands that prepared and served it were another matter entirely. Think about the conditions. Food was often prepared outdoors or in small, poorly ventilated spaces. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best. Animals were often kept in close proximity to living and cooking areas. Insects and rodents were constant companions. Keeping food safe from contamination was an uphill battle, fought without the weapons of refrigeration, sealed containers, or effective disinfectants. It's enough to make your modern, germ-conscious self break out in a cold sweat. You were essentially relying on the cooking process itself, boiling, frying, or baking, to kill off the worst offenders, and hoping for the best with anything eaten raw or handled after cooking. Historians still argue whether medieval people had a better natural immunity to the pathogens in their environment than modern humans, or if they were simply constantly battling low-level infections and accepted frequent illness, including digestive upset, call back to section 1, as a normal part of life. It's likely a bit of both. They were exposed to a lot, but they also suffered from diseases we rarely see today thanks to modern sanitation and medicine. A quirky tidbit about medieval cleanliness. While general hygiene was poor by modern standards, there were some practices that aimed at cleanliness, albeit from a different understanding. For example, washing hands before a meal was a common courtesy, especially in wealthier households, though it might have been more about social ritual than germ avoidance. And public bathhouses existed in some towns, though their cleanliness and reputation varied over time. So, the idea of washing wasn't completely alien, just not linked to germ theory. Consider the ingredients themselves. Were they always fresh? Unlikely, especially for meat and fish that had to be transported. Preservation methods like salting and smoking, call back to section 8, helped, but they didn't eliminate all risks. Vegetables and fruits might be washed, but again, with potentially contaminated water. The grain for the bread, call back to section 7, could be stored in conditions that attracted vermin. It was a food chain with many potential points of contamination from start to finish. The lack of understanding about cross-contamination was also a major factor. The same knife might be used for raw meat and then for slicing cooked bread without washing. The same surfaces might be used for preparing different types of food. Waste from food preparation might not be properly disposed of, attracting more pests. It was a cycle that, from our perspective, looks like a public health nightmare waiting to happen. And often it did. Outbreaks of foodborne illness were not uncommon, though they wouldn't have been understood in terms of specific bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli. They might be blamed on bad humors, divine displeasure, or simply bad air. Even seemingly simple things like tableware were less hygienic. While the wealthy might have metal plates and utensils that could be wiped reasonably clean, the poor often ate with their hands, or used trenchers, call back to section 7, that were then given away. Spoons were common, but forks were rare until later in the period and among the elite. Eating with your hands, while practical for street food, also meant anything on your hands went directly into your mouth. And those hands, as we've established, were probably not recently washed with soap and hot water. Think back to the drinks too. While fermentation made ale and wine safer than water, call back to section 4, the vessels they were served in might not have been thoroughly cleaned. Communal cups or jugs could easily spread illness. It was a world where you took your chances with every bite and every sip. And somehow, humanity persevered. Which either speaks to incredible resilience, a very high tolerance for stomach upset, or maybe just a lot of people didn't live very long anyway, so long-term health effects of poor diet and hygiene weren't the primary concern. Mainstream historical fact time. While there was no understanding of microorganisms, medieval towns did sometimes implement regulations aimed at keeping streets cleaner and controlling nuisances, including rules about where waste could be dumped or where certain trades, like butchery, which produced a lot of waste, could be located. These efforts were more about managing smell and visible filth than preventing disease transmission, but they show some recognition that public cleanliness mattered, even if the underlying science was unknown. So, next time you grab a burger from a food truck or a pastry from a bakery, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern food safety standards. The refrigerated ingredients, the clean surfaces, the hand-washing protocols, the pest control. These are things we completely take for granted, but they are worlds away from the reality of eating in the medieval period. That delicious-smelling pie from the street vendor? It probably came with a side of potential gastrointestinal adventure. It adds a whole new layer of bravery to the act of grabbing a quick medieval snack. You weren't just hungry, you were a culinary daredevil, risking your digestive tract for the sake of convenience and a hot meal. So, you've bravely faced the reality of medieval hygiene, grappling with the understanding that your quick street snack came with a significant side order of potential pathogens. But the challenges of medieval food weren't just about cleanliness. They were also dictated by something far more fundamental and inescapable: the relentless march of the seasons. Unlike today, where you can buy strawberries in January or beef from halfway around the world, the medieval diet was intimately tied to the local growing cycle and the availability of food throughout the year. Your food options changed dramatically depending on whether it was the height of summer abundance or the lean days of winter. Imagine the medieval year unfolding. Spring brought a welcome relief after the long, cold winter. Fresh greens, herbs, and perhaps some early vegetables would start to become available, a much-needed change from the preserved foods that had sustained people for months. Summer was the time of plenty. Gardens and fields yielded a bounty of vegetables, fruits ripened on trees and bushes, and animals were easier to pasture and fatter, providing more meat and milk. This was the season for relatively fresh eating, for enjoying produce that hadn't been salted or dried into oblivion. You might see more vendors selling fresh berries or early apples, or pottages made with newly harvested peas and beans. It was a brief window of relative freshness. Then came autumn, the harvest season. This was the crucial time for gathering and preserving food to last through the coming scarcity. Grain crops were harvested and stored. Fruits were picked, some eaten fresh, but much of it dried, made into preserves with honey, or fermented into cider. Call back to Section 4. Vegetables like root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, turnips, were dug up and stored in cool, dark root cellars or buried in the ground to last through the winter. Animals were often slaughtered in the autumn because there wasn't enough feed to keep large numbers alive through the winter. This meant a temporary abundance of fresh meat, which then had to be preserved through salting, smoking, or pickling. Call back to Section 8. Winter was the season of survival. Fresh food was incredibly scarce, limited to whatever could be stored: dried grains, salted meats and fish, root vegetables, and preserves. The diet became monotonous, heavily reliant on bread. Call back to Section 7, dried pulses, salted provisions, and whatever could be eked out from storage. This is why preservation methods were not just convenient, they were absolutely essential for survival. Without them, starvation was a very real possibility during the lean months. Your medieval stomach wasn't just dealing with questionable hygiene, it was also navigating a drastically changing menu driven by the weather. Historians still argue whether the nutritional deficiencies of the winter diet, with its lack of fresh produce and reliance on heavily salted foods, contributed significantly to health problems and seasonal illnesses in the medieval population. While people survived on preserved foods, they lacked the vitamins and minerals readily available in fresh fruits and vegetables, potentially impacting their immune systems and overall health during the harshest time of the year. The process of preservation was labor-intensive and often required specific conditions. Salting meat and fish involved burying it in large quantities of salt, which drew out the moisture and inhibited bacterial growth. This resulted in food that was incredibly salty and needed soaking before cooking. Call back to Section 8. Smoking involved hanging meat or fish over smoldering wood fires for extended periods, drying it out and infusing it with compounds that acted as preservatives. Drying involved simply leaving foods like fruits, vegetables, or strips of meat in the sun or near a fire until all the moisture evaporated, turning them into tough, leathery versions of their former selves. Pickling involved immersing vegetables in brine or vinegar, creating an acidic environment hostile to bacteria. Think about that street vendor selling meat pies in February. Call back to Section 3. The meat inside was almost certainly preserved meat, likely salted or smoked since fresh meat would be rare and expensive outside of a recent slaughter. The spices, call back to Section 5, would have been even more crucial in winter, not just for flavor and status, but perhaps also for their perceived hot properties to counteract the cold, and certainly to make that rehydrated salt meat more palatable. A winter fritter, call back to Section 2, might be made with dried apples or pears instead of fresh fruit, mixed into the same greasy fat. Call back to Section 6. A quirky tidbit about medieval seasonality: even the availability of certain types of fat could be seasonal. Animal fats like lard and suet were most abundant after the autumn slaughter. While some could be stored, fresh rendered fat might be more readily available in the cooler months, making frying a more common cooking method when other foods were scarce. Conversely, in summer, dairy products like fresh milk, butter, and cheese would be more available, though they spoiled quickly. The rhythm of the seasons also influenced religious observance. Fasting days and periods, like Lent, often occurred during times of natural scarcity, late winter/early spring, making the restriction of meat consumption less of an economic burden, as preserved meat stocks might be running low anyway, and fresh meat was scarce. Fish, being a water food and acceptable on fast days, became even more crucial, relying heavily on preserved stockfish. Call back to Section 8 during these times. This reliance on seasonal availability and preservation methods meant that the medieval diet, especially for the poor, could be quite repetitive and lacking in variety for significant portions of the year. While the wealthy could afford more varied preserved goods and potentially import some items, like spices, year-round, the average person ate what the land and their own preservation efforts provided. It wasn't a world of endless options. It was a world of adapting to what nature offered, or withheld. The street food scene itself would have shifted with the seasons. In summer, you might find vendors selling more fresh fruit tarts or fritters made with seasonal berries. In winter, it would be heartier, relying more on preserved meats, dried pulses made into thick pottages, and foods that could be kept warm in the cold air, like those robust pies. The smell of roasting meat might be less common in winter unless it was a special occasion, as fresh slaughter was less frequent. Mainstream historical fact time: the medieval agricultural calendar dictated much of life, including diet. Major festivals and holidays were often tied to key points in the agricultural year, such as harvest festivals in autumn or celebrations around the slaughter of animals. The availability of food was a constant concern, and the success or failure of a harvest could have devastating consequences, leading to famine and widespread hardship. So, when you imagine that medieval street, remember that the menu wasn't static. It was a reflection of the year's bounty, the success of the harvest, and the effectiveness of preservation. Your medieval junk food experience would change depending on the month, shifting from summer's fleeting freshness to winter's enduring, salty, dried provisions. It adds another layer of complexity to their food world, a constant dance with nature's rhythms, where clever preservation was the key to making it through the lean times, even if it meant sacrificing freshness and variety for half the year. It makes you appreciate the modern miracle of global supply chains and refrigeration, doesn't it? Being able to get fresh lettuce in December is a luxury they couldn't even dream of. So, you've wrestled with the reality of seasonal eating, understanding how the medieval menus shifted drastically with the year. forcing reliance on tough, salty, preserved foods during the lean months. And you've felt that persistent medieval thirst, knowing that clean water was a gamble you often couldn't afford to take, especially after all that dried biscuit and salted meat. This undeniable need for a safe, reliable drink, combined with the seasonal availability of ingredients, drives us deeper into the world of medieval beverages, exploring the specific brews that were the liquid lifeblood of the age. We touched on ale earlier, the ubiquitous, low-alcohol staple, callback to Section 4. But let's spend a little more time with it, because it was the drink for most people, most of the time, across much of Northern Europe. Imagine a typical medieval household, whether a peasant's cottage or a town dwelling. Brewing wasn't just for specialists, it was often a domestic chore, like baking bread, callback to Section 7. The alewife of the household would brew a batch every few days, using grain. Barley was common, but oats and rye were also used, and water, letting wild yeasts in the air do their work. The result was a drink that varied wildly in quality, color, and strength. It could be cloudy, thick, and contain bits of grain sediment, definitely not the clear, filtered lagers of today. The taste was often described as malty, sometimes sweet, and without the bitterness that hops would later provide. Different strengths of ale were brewed, often from the same batch of mash. The first run, using fresh water and grain, would produce the strongest ale, sometimes called ale of the first tapping or strong ale. Subsequent runs, reusing the grain mash with fresh water, would yield progressively weaker brews, like small ale or table ale. This weaker stuff, with its very low alcohol content, maybe 1% or less, was what everyone, including children, drank throughout the day for hydration and calories. The stronger stuff was perhaps for meals, celebrations, or just when you needed a bit more of a boost. Imagine having different taps for different strengths of beer in your kitchen today. That was the medieval reality. Though their strongest ale might still be weaker than your average modern lager. Beyond ale, wine was the other major player, particularly in southern Europe where grapes were cultivated. For the wealthy across Europe, imported wines, especially from France, were highly prized and expensive, a symbol of status much like imported spices, callback to Section 5. These wines would be closer to what we understand as wine today, though often consumed young and sometimes diluted with water or spiced. But local wines, or weaker versions like Piquet, made from the second pressing of grape skins and seeds, were more accessible, if less refined. Piquet was the wine equivalent of small ale, low in alcohol, perhaps a bit sour, but safer than water and providing some calories. Drinking wine, even rough local stuff, could be seen as a step up from ale in some regions, adding another layer to the social hierarchy expressed through food and drink. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of brewing and winemaking was primarily driven by the need for safe drinking water, or if the caloric value and mild intoxicating effects were equally important factors. It's likely a complex interplay, with safety providing a crucial baseline justification, but the pleasure and nutritional benefits solidifying their place as daily necessities. After a long day of physical labor, a few pints of calorie-rich ale would provide both hydration and a welcome energy boost. Other fermented drinks added regional variety. Cider, made from fermented apples, was hugely popular in apple-growing areas like England and parts of France, callback to Section 4. It ranged from sweet and mildly alcoholic to dry and potent. Perry, made from pears, was a less common but similar drink. These fruit-based brews were particularly tied to seasonality, callback to Section 12, with the fruit harvested in autumn and fermented for consumption throughout the year. Mead, brewed from honey and water, was often seen as a more luxurious or festive drink due to the cost of honey, less of an everyday staple for most people. Imagine a medieval street vendor selling hot, spiced cider in winter, a delicious way to warm up and get your daily dose of safe liquid. Though knowing medieval hygiene standards, call back to Section 11, you might want to ask how clean the ladle was. A quirky tidbit about medieval drinks: before hops became widely used as a bittering agent and preservative in ale, brewers experimented with all sorts of other flavorings. These could include a mix of herbs known as grut, which varied by region and might contain things like mugwort, yarrow, or ground ivy. Other additions sometimes included spices, call back to section 5, honey, or even less appealing things like soot or oyster shells, believed to clarify the brew. So, that medieval ale didn't just taste of malt. It could have a fascinatingly complex, and sometimes strange, herbal or spicy profile depending on where and when it was brewed. It makes you appreciate the relative simplicity of just adding hops. Milk was another drink, but it was highly perishable and not commonly consumed fresh by adults, especially in towns, due to spoilage issues. It was more often made into cheese and butter. Whey, the liquid left over from cheese making, might be drunk, as it was less likely to spoil as quickly as fresh milk. Fruit juices were also drunk, but again, without fermentation, they had the same safety concerns as water and spoiled fast, making them less practical for daily consumption or travel. Call back to section 8. The social role of these drinks was significant. Alehouses and taverns were important community hubs, places where people gathered to drink, socialize, hear news, and conduct business. They were the medieval equivalent of the local pub or coffee shop, centers of social life fueled by gallons of low-alcohol brew. The quality of the drink served, and the reputation of the alewife or vintner, were matters of public interest and regulation. Remember the assize of bread and ale, call back to section 7? It didn't just cover bread, it regulated ale too, trying to ensure fair measure and reasonable quality. Drinking vessels varied. The poor might drink from simple earthenware cups or wooden tankards. The wealthy would use pewter, silver, or even gold cups, sometimes inlaid with jewels. Drinking horns, harkening back to earlier traditions, were also used. In alehouses, communal cups were common, which, combined with the lack of understanding of germs, call back to section 11, probably helped spread every cold and flu going around. Cheers to communal germs. This deep dive into medieval drinks reveals a world where beverages were far more than just thirst quenchers. They were sources of calories, safer alternatives to water, social lubricants, economic commodities, and even vehicles for regional identity and culinary experimentation. Hello, Groot. They were consumed in vast quantities, a constant presence from morning till night, fueling bodies and social interactions alike. So, as you finish that imaginary cup of cloudy ale or slightly rough wine, know that you've participated in one of the most fundamental and necessary aspects of medieval daily life, a liquid journey through their world of sustenance, safety, and simple pleasures. Okay, so you've had your fill of the medieval street, the smells, the sounds, the questionable sights, and definitely the food. You've tasted the greasy fritters, gnawed on the robust pie crust, perhaps even risked a bite of that salty preserved meat from a traveler's pack, all washed down with copious amounts of low-alcohol ale or rough wine. And now, after all that, you're probably not feeling great. Let's be honest, your medieval stomach is likely staging a quiet, or perhaps not so quiet, rebellion. Because while medieval food was certainly filling and often tasty by their standards, the digestive consequences of such a diet, combined with the general hygiene of the era, were, shall we say, significant. Imagine the sheer volume of food you've consumed. Remember how bread, call back to section 7, made up 70 to 80% of the calories for most people? That's a lot of dense grain, often coarse and heavy, acting like a cement mixer in your gut. Add to that the immense quantities of fat, call back to section 6, the bubbling lard for frying, the rendered dripping on your bread, the fat mixed into pie fillings. Your digestive system is trying to process a constant influx of highly caloric, often low fiber, and incredibly rich fare. Fat takes a long time to digest, leaving you feeling heavy and sluggish. It's like your medieval body is trying to churn butter internally after every meal. Then there's the quality of the ingredients and the cooking methods. Preserved meats and fish, call back to section 8, heavily salted or smoked, were tough and required effort to digest, contributing to that feeling of a lead weight in your stomach. The repeated heating of frying fats, call back to section 6, could create compounds that are hard on the system. And while fermentation made drinks safer, call back to section 4, section 13, consuming low-alcohol ale or wine constantly throughout the day, while providing hydration and calories, still introduced alcohol into your system, which affects digestion and nutrient absorption. It's like your medieval gut was permanently on a slow, boozy, high-fat roller coaster ride. But beyond just feeling full and uncomfortable, the lack of hygiene, call back to Section 11, was a major pathway to serious digestive issues. Remember the street vendors, the questionable water sources, the lack of understanding of germs? Foodborne illnesses were incredibly common. What we'd recognize as food poisoning, caused by bacteria like E. coli or salmonella, was likely a frequent occurrence. You'd eat something that looked and smelled fine, but if it had been handled improperly, stored at the wrong temperature, or contaminated by flies or dirty water, you were in for a rough time. That cheeky line from the intro, call back to Section 1, about the medieval squirts? That was a daily reality for many. Diarrhea, vomiting, stomach cramps, these weren't just unpleasant symptoms. They could be life-threatening in a world without antibiotics or rehydration solutions. Parasites were also a common issue. Contaminated water, undercooked meat, especially pork, and poor sanitation meant that intestinal worms and other parasites were widespread. These could cause chronic digestive problems, nutrient deficiencies, and general ill health. It's not a pleasant thought, but it was a part of the medieval reality that came with their food systems. Imagine trying to enjoy a delicious medieval meal while also hosting a variety of unwelcome guests in your intestines. Appetizing, right? Historians still argue whether medieval people simply had a higher tolerance for these kinds of digestive upsets due to constant exposure, or if chronic gastrointestinal problems were a significant drain on public health and a major cause of mortality, especially among the young and old. While they might have developed some resilience, the evidence from medical texts and skeletal remains suggests that digestive diseases and parasitic infections were endemic and contributed significantly to the lower life expectancy compared to today. Think back to the humoral theory of medicine, call back to Section 10. When a medieval person experienced digestive distress, they wouldn't think food poisoning. They'd likely think their humors were out of balance. A rumbling stomach or diarrhea might be attributed to an excess of cold or wet humors, or an imbalance of bile. The remedies prescribed would focus on restoring balance through foods with opposing humoral properties, or perhaps herbal concoctions believed to cleanse the system, rather than targeting specific pathogens. It was a completely different framework for understanding what was happening inside their bodies. A quirky tidbit about medieval digestion and remedies. Medieval medical texts often recommend specific foods or drinks believed to aid digestion after a heavy meal, particularly a banquet, call back to Section 9. These might include spiced wines, comfits, sugar-coated spices or seeds like fennel or anise, call back to Section 9, or certain types of cheese. These were thought to close the stomach and help process the rich food. So, while we might reach for an antacid, they were reaching for a sugar-coated anise seed or a glass of hot, spiced wine. Different approach, likely questionable efficacy from our perspective, but it shows they were well aware that their diet posed digestive challenges. The sheer monotony of the diet for the poor, heavily reliant on coarse bread and pottage, also played a role. While perhaps less likely to cause acute food poisoning than street meat, it lacked variety and essential nutrients, potentially leading to long-term digestive weakness and susceptibility to other illnesses. The seasonal shifts, call back to Section 12, meant periods of relying almost entirely on tough, preserved foods, which would put a strain on the digestive system compared to periods of relative freshness in summer. Your medieval gut had to be incredibly resilient, constantly adapting to different textures, salt levels, and potential contaminants throughout the year. Mainstream historical fact time, dysentery, often caused by contaminated food and water, was a common and deadly disease throughout the Middle Ages. Outbreaks could devastate communities, highlighting the direct link between poor sanitation, contaminated food, and widespread illness. While they didn't understand the bacterial cause, they certainly understood the devastating effects of such fluxes of the bowel. So, as you reflect on your imaginary medieval culinary journey, remember that the taste and convenience came at a price. Your medieval body was working overtime to process the density, the fat, the salt, and the potential pathogens lurking in every bite. Feeling full and satisfied was often accompanied by a significant risk of discomfort, illness, and chronic digestive issues. It makes you appreciate the relatively smooth sailing of your modern digestive system, navigating a world of refrigeration, pasteurization, and public health standards. That greasy medieval pie might have filled you up, but it could also lay you low. It was a literal gamble with your gut, taken every single day. So, you've survived the digestive trials, you've gained a newfound appreciation for modern plumbing, and you understand that the medieval diet, while filling, came with its own set of challenges for your insides. But despite the risks, despite the density, despite the potential for gastrointestinal adventure, people in the medieval world craved quick, convenient, tasty food, just like we do today. This brings us to the big question: how does medieval junk food compare to our modern equivalent? Are we really all that different in our desire for a fast, satisfying bite, or just separated by centuries of changing technology and hygiene standards? Let's start with the similarities. At their core, both medieval street food and modern junk food serve a similar purpose: convenience and quick energy. You're busy, you're hungry, you don't have time or resources for a full, sit-down meal. You need something you can grab, eat on the go, and that gives you calories fast. A medieval pie from a street vendor, call back to Section 1, Section 3, or a handful of hot fritters, call back to Section 2, fits that bill perfectly, just like a modern burger, slice of pizza, or donut does. Both are designed to be relatively cheap and accessible, providing sustenance without requiring a kitchen or formal dining. They satisfy that immediate craving for something palatable and filling. Both lean heavily on certain macronutrients that our bodies are wired to crave: fat and sugar, call back to Section 6, Section 2. The medieval fryer bubbling with lard and the modern deep fryer are siblings under the skin, both producing that addictive combination of crispy exterior and rich, calorie-dense interior. The sweet hit from honey-soaked fritters or spiced fruit tarts, call back to Section 2, is the ancestor of our modern sugar rush from candy bars and sodas. Now for the differences, and this is where things get interesting. The most obvious difference is in the ingredients and processing. While medieval food preparation certainly wasn't clean by our standards, call back to Section 11, the ingredients themselves were often less processed than in modern junk food. That meat in the pie was actual meat, perhaps not the best cut, but recognizable. The flour for the bread, call back to Section 7, was milled grain. The fruit in the fritters was, well, fruit. Modern junk food, on the other hand, often relies on highly refined flours, processed sugars, like high fructose corn syrup, hydrogenated fats, artificial flavors, and a long list of additives designed for maximum shelf life and addictive taste. While a medieval fritter might be greasy and made in questionable conditions, it was arguably closer to a whole food than a mass-produced, factory-extruded snack cake. Historians still argue whether medieval street food should even be labeled junk food, given its role as essential, calorie-dense sustenance for a physically demanding life, contrasting it with modern junk food which is often consumed in excess of daily needs in a less physically active world. It's a fair point: one was survival fuel, the other is often pure indulgence. Another key difference lies in preservation. Medieval preservation methods, call back to Section 8, like salting, smoking, and drying, resulted in tough, intensely flavored foods that bore little resemblance to their fresh counterparts. Modern preservation relies heavily on refrigeration, freezing, vacuum sealing, and chemical additives, allowing processed foods to remain shelf-stable for months or years while retaining a texture and appearance closer to fresh, or at least, what we perceive as desirable. Your medieval dried fish biscuit, call back to Section 8, was a monument to durability. Your modern packaged snack chip is a monument to complex food science. The nutritional context is also vastly different. For the medieval person, the high fat and calorie content of street food was often a necessity, a way to get enough energy to survive and work, call back to Section 6. For many in the modern world, where food is abundant and physical labor less common, the high calories, fat, and sugar in junk food contribute to health problems like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Medieval people faced different health challenges from their diet, parasites, food poisoning, digestive upset from density and lack of fiber. Call back to section 14, but they weren't typically struggling with metabolic syndrome from consuming too many empty calories. Your medieval gut might have been battling a rogue bacteria, but your modern gut might be battling chronic inflammation from processed ingredients. The role of flavorings also differs. While medieval cooks used expensive spices, call back to section 5, to add flavor and status, their palette of readily available flavorings was much smaller than ours. Modern junk food uses a vast array of artificial and natural flavorings, flavor enhancers, like MSG, and precise combinations of salt, sugar, and fat engineered to trigger maximum pleasure responses in our brains. A medieval spiced meat pie had distinct, earthy, sweet and savory notes from real spices and animal fat. A modern savory snack might have a complex flavor profile built from dozens of chemical compounds and artificial ingredients designed solely for hyperpalatability. It's the difference between a craftsman using precious, natural pigments and a factory using synthetic dyes. Even the drinks, call back to section 4, section 13, highlight the contrast. Medieval drinks were primarily low-alcohol fermented beverages, providing calories and safety from contaminated water. While they had their own issues, sediment, variable quality, communal cups, call back to section 11, they weren't loaded with refined sugar and artificial colors like many modern sodas and energy drinks. Your medieval ale might give you a mild buzz and some calories. Your modern soda gives you a massive sugar spike and a cascade of metabolic effects. A quirky tidbit about medieval versus modern. While medieval people didn't have potato chips, they did have early forms of fried dough, like those fritters, call back to section 2, which were essentially the ancestors of modern donuts or churros. So, the craving for simple, fried, sugary dough is apparently a timeless human constant. We just perfected the delivery system, and arguably made it less nutritious. The cultural perception is also different. While medieval street food was often looked down upon by the elite as the food of the poor and laborers, it was generally accepted as a necessary part of urban life. Modern junk food exists alongside a vast array of other food options and is often viewed with guilt or seen as a treat or indulgence rather than a daily necessity. We have the luxury of choice in a way medieval people simply didn't. Mainstream historical fact time. The widespread availability and affordability of modern junk food is a direct result of the Industrial Revolution and advancements in food processing, transportation, and preservation technologies that began in the 19th and 20th centuries. These innovations allowed for mass production, global distribution, and extended shelf life on a scale unimaginable in the medieval period, fundamentally changing how and what people eat. Ultimately, while the desire for quick, tasty, convenient food seems hardwired into the human experience across centuries, the nature and impact of that food have changed dramatically. Medieval street food was a pragmatic response to the challenges of daily life, providing essential calories and relative safety in a world of scarcity and poor sanitation, despite its roughness and potential for immediate digestive upset. Modern junk food is a product of abundance and technology, offering hyperpalatability and convenience but contributing to long-term health crises. You might have risked the medieval squirts for a hot pie, but you're risking different, slower-acting issues with your modern drive-through meal. It makes you wonder what future historians will say about our dietary choices, doesn't it? And as we drift back from the bustling, greasy, flavorful streets of the medieval town, leaving behind the echoes of vendors hawking their wares and the scent of wood smoke and frying fat, let the images soften, the sounds fade. The sharp tastes of spice and salt and fat begin to mellow in your mind. Imagine the warmth of the low-alcohol ale, the sturdy feel of the dense bread, the simple, necessary sustenance, the vast difference from your own pantry. The flickering torchlight gives way to the quiet dark, the distant sounds of the medieval world recede, leaving only the gentle hum of the fan, and the soft quiet of your own space. You are back in your own time, safe and warm, the flavors and feelings of the past settling like dust. Let your body relax, feel the comfort of your bed, the journey is over, the past is quiet now, just breathe softly, let the images fade, drifting into sleep.